The current state of video games is not working. It may be hard to notice this at a glance, especially with so many great games coming out recently. But when you dig deeper, you can see the industry is falling apart. Games are taking much longer to make, and their budgets are getting way too high. It's forcing companies who are seeing their bottom lines decreasing to make some desperate moves to make more profits, like raising prices and finding new ways to basically resell the same product. They are laying off their developers, and they're investing in exploitative games as a service games with tons and tons of microtransactions. Video games are on a collision course for disaster, and the industry simply cannot continue like this. But what if games can be saved? Dr. Pooplove here, and that's what I would like to explore in this video. And a very special thank you to my YouTube members. Your support helps make videos like these possible. Let's get right into it. Remember when games from your favorite developers came out pretty quickly? Like between 2007 and 2013, Naughty Dog was able to put out an entire Uncharted trilogy and The Last of Us. That's one amazing video game every 2 years. An unthinkable output today from a studio that has released only 2 new games in the past 10 years after that, and has had to put out remasters and remakes to try to pad the gaps. It might even be more insane to realize that before that, Naughty Dog had released 4 Crash Bandicoot games in 4 consecutive years. And you can find similar trajectories and patterns with other game studios. Rockstar, for instance, with their GTA games, have had a similar trajectory, with the initial entries coming out in quick succession. But now, GTA 6 is not slated to come out until a whole 12 years after the initial release of GTA 5, and that's if it actually does come out in 2025. And what I'm getting at here is one of the biggest reasons that games are getting so expensive is how long they're taking to make these days. And when a game takes longer and longer to make, it means that companies have to pay more for their developers' salaries. They have to pay more for their contracts, and it's a longer period of time before they're able to ultimately put the game out and make their money back. So what's going on? Why are these games taking so long? And why are they so expensive? Well, for one, it's graphics. These days, so much emphasis is put on how good and realistic a character looks. Every little nostril hair has to be perfect and accounted for. The worlds that these characters inhabit need to feel expansive and immersive and lived in. And it doesn't help that on Twitter especially, if your game is lacking in the graphics department, you get lampooned endlessly. Remember Craig from Halo Infinite? That meme was brutal. And maybe it wasn't the only reason that 343 ended up delaying Halo Infinite, but it must have been kind of a big reason that they delayed it. And if a game needs more time because of a delay, that means it needs more money. But another major aspect to this is game length. These games from Naughty Dog that came out, they took between 7 to 13 hours roughly to complete. But nowadays, it's expected that a campaign for a game take roughly 20 to 25 hours to complete, and that there is enough side content injected in to almost double that length. This means developers have to do so much more now just to consider a game complete. Again, social media doesn't help here, as hours to complete are seen as a sign of a game worth playing. And to be fair to gamers, this is an expensive hobby and games cost a lot. You want to get a good value out of your purchase. And one of the easiest ways to measure that is with how long you spend playing a game. Of course, though, adding time to beat means more story to create, more locations to visit, side quests, and more bugs to QA. Basically, it's all going to add cost. Now, of course, there are other factors here into why games are taking so long to make, but these things are the 2 major ones that I think can be addressed in a reasonable way that, well, won't ruin gaming. And that is, well, what if they made these games shorter and with worse graphics? Now, don't get me wrong, we still want our games to look beautiful, but most games these days do look beautiful. And devs seem to be overemphasizing the importance of graphics, even at the expense of fun and enjoyment. The Last of Us Part 1 remake, for instance, pushed the boundaries on what a game could look like, with new advancements in graphics. But Naughty Dog kind of forgot to spend any time improving the gameplay by adding the dodge or the prone, or adding in the factions multiplayer. It was an impressive outing, and I think it did sell well enough, given that it had a nice boost being released around the time of of the new TV show. But was this package really that appealing to gamers? Was improving an already beautiful game and mostly only focusing on making it more beautiful the right move? While gamers do love graphics, the data seems to suggest that they don't care as much about them as you might think. Some of the most popular games to come out in recent times are not offering the best graphics. Look at Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. Heck, look at any of Nintendo's developed games. The graphics and frame rate do not hold up to even last generation PS4 games. But does it really matter? Those games outsell the most beautiful games by a large margin. Other examples are Fortnite, Baldur's Gate 3, and Minecraft. All these games are outclassing these crazy expensive games because those studios are investing in what truly engages gamers, and that is the gameplay and the experience. So does that mean that Naughty Dog, Sony Santa Monica, Ninja Theory, and other big AAA studios should stop innovating in the graphics department? No, of course not, especially when that is what a lot of these studios are trying to be known for. But when your budgets are this crazy big and your games are already looking ridiculous beautiful, maybe you can put your foot off the gas a little bit and focus more on just putting together an engaging, holistic package. Seems like pumping more money in to squeeze out better graphics at this point are just creating diminishing returns. I personally would rather your puddles and your window reflections not be perfect if that means that we have to wait so much longer. I mean, does anyone really care what Craig actually looks like now in Halo Infinite? Do our favorite characters' butt hair, does it need to look that stark? No. And look, noise on Twitter may seem to suggest otherwise, especially with these obnoxious console warriors, but Twitter is such a small part of the gaming pool and it really doesn't represent the majority. But what about game length? Because yeah, we want to get good value out of the games we buy, especially if the prices seem to keep going up. Well, I do think that games can be shorter, at least in some ways. And by that, I mean a story of some of these games could be much smaller, say 10 to 15 hours in length. Honestly, I believe that would make for a much more cohesive package. Some of these games with long storylines, they just feel bloated and they lack good pacing, and sometimes they make the stakes of the story just feel lower. A good story does not need to force itself to be 10 to 15 hours longer than it really has to be just to fill out some arbitrary hours requirement. Instead, games should just be as long as they need to be. And if you want to add more hours and replayability, well, that's where I think we should go back to the way things were in the PS3 and the Xbox 360 days. And that is tack on a multiplayer, add a fun new mode. That's right, if you really just want to add some game length, add some replayability with something like a tacked on multiplayer. Now, I can see that some of these studios are kind of getting the hint here. Naughty Dog and Sony Santa Monica in particular have added roguelikes, which does seem to be a good start for sure. God of War Valhalla has been praised for even adding story content in it, but having some sort of procedural continual dungeon crawler is adding a lot more replayability to that game. Similarly, The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered's No Return mode does seem to be adding a lot more fun replayability moments. But if devs want even more replayability, they should be adding a multiplayer using the same mechanics from the game itself, because it's a PvP environment where player-to-player combat actually adds even more replayability as you're trying to outsmart more than just AI. I mean, look at The Last of Us Part 2, for instance. This was one of Naughty Dog's most expensive games and the longest in length by far. The story was so long and so ambitious that they decided to exclude the multiplayer, which was getting ambitious on its own, and they decided to make that its own separate thing. Now, The Last of Us Part 2 did not sell nearly as well compared to Naughty Dog's other games. And on top of that, this separate standalone multiplayer, it crumbled under the pressure of needing to be this thriving live service. So it got canceled. Now imagine if The Last of Us Part 2 had shortened their story and instead did include that multiplayer. Well, honestly, it would have likely sold better. The pacing that caused many to have issues with that game's story would have been improved. And even for those that didn't like that story, weren't ever going to like that story, well, they had something to keep them entertained by hopping in to play a multiplayer. And you can imagine that if this had happened there would have been a much different story regarding Naughty Dog and their successes today. In many ways, I think the solution here is to look back to your past, look at what had been working, and just go back a little bit. Now, all in all, I do think it's possible for these game companies to save gaming by just focusing on what worked in the past. Focus on gameplay, focus on good storytelling, and adding fun modes for replayability, and not worrying so much about the graphics or the game length. I think in the end, if they go this route, we can get the games we deserve, and studios can stop with some of these crazy money-making tactics like raising prices and trying to resell us games that have just made gaming feel like a bummer lately. But do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments. And thanks again to my YouTube members who have joined the Bowel Movement. But otherwise, so long, Pooper Troopers.